To finish off our study of the chemical digestion, we're going to talk about lipids, DNA, or nucleic acids, and also other nutrients such as vitamins and water and so on. So starting off with lipids, the big challenge with lipids is that they are nonpolar. That makes them insoluble in water, which is polar, and in most of the body's fluids, which are polar. So they tend to kind of precipitate out and form big fat globules that the body has to kind of deal with. Now your body likes fat. It feels satisfied when it takes in fat. So it's actually really important that when we have fat in our food that we take it in. So we go to a lot of trouble and energy to try to take in fats. Small pieces of fats are going to be surrounded by biodetergents to form an emulsion of fats. So we're looking at here an emulsion of fats where we have little fat globules, much smaller than this big one here, and surrounded by these little green bile salts. And each exposed fat then is digested by lipase in the small intestine, of course. An example of this is a triglyceride. A triglyceride can actually be broken apart into its component parts. Glycerol on the one end, and 3 fatty acid tails, which are completely nonpolar. All of these can be used by the body to produce energy. And when we talk about the transport of lipids, it's tricky because bile salts and phospholipids, again, are going to form micelles around the small fat globules. These can actually be transported across the lipid membranes just by simple diffusion. They are then going to form a chylomicron. A chylomicron is where you have triglycerides that will reform inside of these epithelial cells and are coated with proteins to form lipoprotein droplets. These droplets then are going to leave the cells. These droplets called chylomicrons are going to leave the cells and then enter into the lymph, usually the lymph, sometimes the blood vessels. So you see this structure here called a lacteal. That's actually a member of the lymphatic system. And once they enter into the lacteals, they will again be hydrolyzed by the lipoprotein lipase. Okay, so there's just a number of steps to basically break down fats, surround them with different structures, and make sure that they are able to be present in a polar environment so they're transported as easily as possible. All right, in regards to DNA and RNA, a long string of DNA can be broken apart into its nucleotide monomer by nucleases that are secreted by the pancreas. So the nuclease is able to break down a long strip of DNA or long strip of RNA and form a nucleotide, but a nucleotide itself is actually made of 3 component parts: a phosphate, a ribose sugar or a deoxyribose sugar, and then the nitrogenous base, that GCTA, that we know gives a base its actual character. So the long strip is broken apart by pancreatic nucleases, but the nucleotides themselves can be broken apart by some brush border enzymes, nucleosidases and phosphatases. The pieces then can be actively transported across the epithelium and directly into the blood, and then they can either be recycled or used for energy. All right, so other nutrients that we discuss are vitamins. Vitamins can be fatty or non-fat. So vitamins are transported by simple diffusion if they are polar or non-fatty, but they can actually be transported. They kind of hide themselves inside of fat and then are transported with the fat micelles, with the chylomicrons. So yeah, it just depends on whether the vitamin is a polar or a non-polar structure. If you are taking in fatty vitamins, it's important that you also consume them with some kind of fat. Otherwise, there's just no way for the body to actually absorb them. All right, electrolytes that are important to us, electrolytes also called ions. Sodium is a biggie. The sodium ions will be transported into the body by active transport. Chloride ions as well. Potassium ions, along with other things, are going to be coupled to water absorption. So potassium ions can be absorbed as long as there is water being absorbed. Iron can be actively transported, but immediately binds to the protein ferritin for storage. Iron is actually toxic to the body, so you have to make sure that it's bound up as quickly as possible. Calcium can be absorbed or not absorbed depending whether you need calcium or not. And your body is meticulous about making sure that you have just the right levels of blood calcium at all times. And this absorption rate of calcium from your food is going to be regulated by the hormone PTH, or parathyroid hormone. All right, and then lastly, of course, there is water. About 95% of your water is actually absorbed by the small intestines via osmosis. Usually this osmosis is coupled to sodium uptake. So when I said that sodium is actively transported, this is just the first step to making sure a whole bunch of other things are transported as well. So sodium is actively transported into the blood. Water follows. The rule of thumb is where sodium goes, water follows. Keep that in mind, by the way, when we talk about the urinary system. So water absorption, after sodium is absorbed, water just automatically follows, and then this allows for other substances to follow their concentration gradients and pass more readily, such as potassium.